Welcome. My name is Michael Crawford. I'm a senior historian here at the Naval History and Heritage Command. This is the inaugural presentation of a year-long series on needs and opportunities in the history of the modern United States Navy. In consultation with a number of experts and naval flag officers, historians here at the command, produced a list of 10 subject areas in the history of the U.S. Navy since World War II that possess two common features. They are historical subjects of high value to Navy planners and decision makers, and their coverage in historical literature possesses huge holes. We have engaged scholars outside of the command who have specialized knowledge on these subjects to analyze and report on what has been written, what has not been written, and what could and ought to be written about them. Our goals in sponsoring these presentations, the texts of which will be published on the command's website, are to inspire scholars to take up these subjects and to provide a program for the study of the history of the United States Navy for the next 20 years. This morning, Tom Hone will report on his analysis of the historiography of programming and acquisition management since 1950, with a focus on the Navy. Following the report, a panel of experts will discuss the implications of Tom's analysis for the Navy and naval history. We invite the audience to participate in that discussion. Thomas Hone, PhD, has had a long experience as an executive in the Office of the Secretary of Defense and is an award-winning author of many papers and books on naval subjects, including Power and Change, the Administrative History of the Office of the Chief of Naval Operations, 1946 and 1986, American and British Aircraft Carrier Development, 1911 to 1941, and Battle Line, the United States Navy, 1919 to 1939. He is taught at the Naval War College and the National Defense University, among other institutions. Our commentators will be Dr. Larry Ferrero, who is Director of Research, Defense Acquisition University Center of Defense Acquisition Research, Executive Editor of the Defense Acquisition Research Journal, and author of two highly regarded books on the history of science, Ships and Science, The Birth of Naval Architecture and the Scientific Revolution, 1600-1800, and Measure of the Earth, the Enlightenment Expedition that Reshaped Our World. Dr. Walter S. Moody is a retired U.S. Air Force historian and author of Building a Strategic Air Force. As an independent contractor after retirement, he worked as an independent contractor, including membership on the team of the Defense Acquisition History Project under the sponsorship of the Army. And Dr. Justin Lance Eldridge is a retired U.S. Army colonel, former law enforcement officer in America's Wild West, and is a historian with the Naval History and Heritage Command who has focused for the past several years on the Navy's acquisition of first-class warships. Unfortunately, we're having technical difficulties, and there were two brilliant PowerPoints that you're going to have to just not look. You're just going to have to look at the speakers.
Thank you, Michael. I'm going to ask my colleagues to take a seat up front. That way you know who they are, you know who to nail if you have any criticism. One more thing. Just go ahead. So I will start without it. All right, we're going to start without the slides, which I counted on. So I will have to do without those. I'm Tom Hone. I'm the first one who's going to talk. I wrote this paper. It's a paper on historiography. Now, when I was asked by Michael to write this, the first thing I did was look up historiography in the dictionary. In my dictionary, I found 3 different definitions. So I thought, well, this is very much like the Pentagon. We're not quite sure where we're going, but we're going to get there as quickly as we can. So this is really a talk about how historians have looked at acquisition, programming, and budgeting. And Michael asked me to start at 1950. The problem is, can't start at 1950. Have to start in World War II, especially for acquisition, because so much of the tradition and the practices and processes of military acquisition have their roots in World War II. And so you have to go back and look at those. And so my first slide, which I guess we're not going to get, right? Right, we're not going to get it. All right. is my view of the ideal acquisition history. And it is a book by the late historian and Reserve Brigadier General Irving Britton Hawley Jr., a book called Buying Aircraft, published by the Center for Military History of the United States Army in 1964. This is the ideal acquisition history. And I almost brought my copy, but it's a very thick book, so I didn't do it. I wish I had to show it to you. I found this book when I was down at the Defense Acquisition University, then called the Defense Management College, the SMC, Defense System Management College. I found the book in the library there. I was having a lot of trouble. I was taking the course on program management, and I kept saying, why do we do things this way? Why do we write statements of work like this? Where did this kind of contract come from? And the instructors who were there on the faculty teaching somebody like me said, go in the corner, stop bothering me, it doesn't matter, just do it. It was very, yeah, that's how acquisition management was taught. It was taught as get your hands on it, practice it, and do it. Well, I'm not that kind of a person. I asked the question, why? Where did it come from? And I found the answers in Hawley's book, because he talks about it. And he does it in detail, and he covers the whole range. He talks about national policies, he talks about defense planning, he talks about financing, he talks about contracting, he talks about solicitations, he talks about negotiations. It's all in this one book, and I'll give you the title again. By the way, there are copies of my paper back behind the fellow who's running the camera. So if you want to take one, by all means do so, because in the paper I get the chance to go into some detail about these things. But Hawley showed the way. I read the book, and my copy is all marked up. I thought, wow, here it is. Here are the answers. And that taught me something about the acquisition process. It was something you didn't develop as a set of axioms. It was something that was developed in practice, the hard way. When people found the old process that they had before World War II didn't work, they came together and they, over time, created something new. And then they tried to codify that in the late 1940s with the Armed Services Procurement Act and the regulations that flowed from it. So it was always this catch-up game that they were playing. And that, when I understood that, then it made it possible for me to really appreciate the acquisition process. I was never a great expert in it. I was classified an acquisition professional, but I can't manage software. That's a generational thing. My son calls me the analog dinosaur, and he's quite right. I look at this, it doesn't work, right? And I say, yes, this is how this always works. and it's nothing wrong with the people who do it. It's not that. It's just the system that they've embraced. And in fact, it has reached out to embrace them. So I want to start with the notion that there is an ideal acquisition history. It was done not for the Navy, but for the Army, in this case, the Army Air Corps. And it really is a marvelous book. I did write, did I say I wrote to Hawley after I read the book? And I said, this is great, it just opened my eyes. And he wrote a nice note back and said, it took me 10 years to write that thing, to do the research and write it. 10 years. And he said, I'm glad to know somebody appreciates it. And that's going to be one of the themes I'm going to give you this morning very quickly, which is that one of the reasons we haven't had more acquisition histories like this is because it's hard to do. You have to know the subject. You have to have the time. You have to have the support. And guess what? You're not going to get it. You're going to have enough trouble learning the subject. It's going to be very hard to find a sponsor. It's going to be very difficult to have the time to yourself. Imagine taking 10 years to work on a book like this. Most people will say, well, if you're on a university faculty, what are you doing? Why are you wasting your time? You know, show me your productivity. So the next step I wanted to take was to say, has there been a lot of work in the field since World War II, since 1950? The answer is yes. And I list a lot of things in the paper. If you're really interested, get a copy. And if there are copies, and if there are no copies left, give me your card and I'll send it to you digitally. There's an awful lot of stuff out there. I sat down after Michael asked me to do this and started writing titles on a sheet of paper. And I got another sheet of paper, and another sheet of paper, and another sheet of paper. It's a lot of stuff out there. A lot of it is case studies, and I want to talk about some of those. How many of you like airplanes? Oh yeah, there we are. How many of you like ships? Tanks? Stuff bombs? Yes. All right. No, I'm serious. There's one argument I'm going to make to you is that you cannot do this history unless you understand things. You really have to understand things. And that drives you to the work of a lot of writers who love airplanes, who love ships. They are not acquisition historians, but they like this stuff and the people who make it and the people who use it. And they write about it. And therefore they are a source. Maybe not certainly the best source, but they are a source. And so I have a slide which showed the following works. McMaster, The Story of the F-8 Crusader by Barrett Tillman. Anybody read Barrett Tillman? Yeah. I know him. He's kind of crazy. But I like his work. I read his stuff. When he writes something, I read it. It tells me something about a system, about a physical thing, an airplane. And of course, I also had the cover from one of Norman Friedman's books, his book on the design histories of U.S. aircraft carriers. Extraordinary series of case studies. He's done one on battleships, cruisers, destroyers, aircraft carriers, submarines, small attack craft, amphibious ships. These are extraordinary case studies. They're extraordinary not only because of the detail, but also because he goes across time. Here's where a battleship design came from in 1910. Here's where it came from in 1939. That sort of thing. So you get to see some comparisons across time, so long as he has the information available. Then I cited something that became a movie, a book called The Pentagon Wars, Reformers Challenged the Old Guard, by James Merton, who was then a lieutenant colonel on the staff of the Office of the Secretary of Defense. This was made into a movie with Kelsey Grammer as one of the performers, and Cary Elves is how I pronounce his name. Has anybody seen The Pentagon Wars? Yes, it is. On the one hand, when I saw it, it was very frustrating because there were some things that weren't said that I think needed to be said. On the other hand, I loved it because what's the theme? Who saw it? What's the theme?
Test and evaluation.
Well, yes, it's all about test and evaluation because look, one of the innovations in acquisition management was this notion that you would test something. You would do an operational test of every major system to find out if it really worked. It was really suited to what it was designed to do, right? And so what was the Army doing? They were testing the Bradley, and what were they doing? They were gaming the whole testing process. Of course, why?
Because they wanted to approve.
Well, yeah, they wanted the vehicle approved. Now, why was there any problem in the first place? What was the Bradley supposed to go with? The M1. The M1, right? Who's been up close to an M1 tank? Okay. What's the M1 tank like? Well, laugh? What do you mean? It's a hell of a vehicle, right? Big gun. How big is that gun? 120 millimeters. You know how big that shell is? Who's seen it? Who stood next to it? How big? Well, yeah, the whole thing, if you're the casing and everything stands about this high. This is a very big gun. This is a land battleship. And it's designed to give out a lot of punishment and take it in return if it has to. What about the Bradley? Is it heavily armored like the tank? No. Is it heavily gunned like the tank? No. It carries soldiers, right? Wouldn't you want to protect your soldiers if they're going into battle and accompanying the tank? There's where the whole crisis of the film comes from in the book. How did Bradley stand up? Did it meet its requirements? And so you get a very interesting case study and a very funny movie. I mentioned some other case studies. Fort Kelly, the reporter, always loved defense topics, did an interesting book on the Hornet, on where the F-A-18 came from. An engineer, a retired engineer by the name of Tommy Thomason, wrote a book. He's written several books, but the one I was going to show you was U.S. Naval Air Superiority, the development of shipborne jet fighters from 1943 to 1962. Again, the details of the design. But that's important, and that's what you have to understand if you're going to do acquisition. I also wanted to mention to you the book by Norman Polmar on Cold War submarines. where he compares Soviet submarines to US submarines through the Cold War. Again, these are all case studies, some of them very extended across time, but they're extremely useful. But they have holes in them, because you get to see just part of the process, not the whole process. And the reason I like Irving Britton Holly's book is because he does everything. He talks about policy, he talks about financing, he talks about contracting, negotiating, dealing with the builders and the producers of airplanes. I had another slide on more case studies. There's a book by Al Chrisman called Sailors, Scientists, and Rockets. It's a study of the Navy's installation at China Lake and what the people there have done. There's an interesting book on systems engineering by Glenn Bugos. It's the F-4 Phantom, Engineering the Phantom, Parts and Systems. I used to teach Introduction to Systems Engineering down at the Defense Systems Management College. I don't have an engineering degree. I got a graduate degree in political science. So people would say, what is that guy doing teaching the Introduction to Systems Engineering? And I'll tell you what my first slide was. Have you ever seen these stickers, bumper stickers? Share the road with a runner? Who's seen those? You've seen, right? I would put that up and say, is that good systems engineering or not? Well, you know, I'm dealing with mostly military officers, so they're going, oh, it's cheesy civilian. What game is he playing? I said, just give me an answer. And about half of them would say yes, and half say no. It's not. It's absolutely lousy systems engineering, okay? Because you're putting something heavy and fast, an automobile, in the same space as you're putting somebody who is slow, human being, and soft. You don't want to do that. You don't want to do that. I almost got run down in downtown DC a couple of weeks ago by a guy on a bicycle. Bad systems engineering. I'm walking along. Look, I'm 70 years old. I'm walking along like this, you know. When you get older, your mind wavers a little. And this bicycle is suddenly in my face. And he missed me when I kept it, because he probably would have killed me. In fact, out in Fairfax County, a biker did kill, not a motorcycle, a regular bicycle, killed a lady out walking on a bike path. Yeah, well, because it's bad systems engineering. You don't want to put people and fast-moving objects together. You certainly don't want to do that if the person has two dogs on leashes. That's why I quit riding a bike. I got a bad accident avoiding a lady with two great big dogs on leashes. And at the end she said, are you all right? I said, no, I'm a victim of bad systems engineering. At that stage, I think, you know, she's trying to decide, do I run? Is he a lunatic? But anyway, so these studies are out there, and they're worth looking at. We have interesting histories of the Atomic Energy Commission, the Atomic Shield, which was done by Hewlett Duncan. We have another book on the F-18 Hornet by a fellow by the name of Dennis Jenkins, who's also an engineer and likes airplanes. It's a very interesting book. Also, I always want to use the old name, GAO. It's now the Government Accountability Office. They have been doing case studies of acquisition and budgets and spending for decades. And to my knowledge, nobody's sort of gone through all that to talk about what it showed us, if anything. You know, what were the big lessons to come from that book? And then, of course, I have to mention the Polaris System Development by Harvey Sapolsky at MIT. This is where Sapolsky looked at PERT, you know, P-E-R-T, the acronym, Program Evaluation Review Technique, right? And I know some of you have read this, who's read the Sapolsky book. What did he find? What did he find about PERT? What was it? Mark, you know.
I do.
Well, tell the rest of it.
Oh, well, PERT wasn't used for the purpose it was supposed to be used for. PERT was used to disguise the informal and real-life negotiations and bargainings that Admiral Rayburn did, and was also used to protect the program from Congress. Congress would be brought into the briefing rooms, they would see the various colored charts put on the wall, and they would say, oh, this is a well-managed program, and Rayburn would say, oh, yes, it is, and then he would go off, make his telephone calls, book airplane tickets, and go out and talk to the technology developers to find out what was going on. It was a great program.
They did Polaris on the run, all right? But if you went to Congress and said that, we're making this up as we go along. There are two great movies about acquisition, but they're just little scenes in them. One is Raiders of the Lost Ark, where Indiana Jones, Harrison Ford played him. They're in the desert, right? The bad guys are going to take the Ark of the Covenant away, right? They've got it in a box and they're going to take it away. And Karen Allen is playing the female lead, and at one stage she says to him, "What are you going to do now?" And he says, "I don't know, I'm making this up as I go along." And that's a great thing to be able to say in acquisition, but you don't dare. If you do, everybody's after you. But you may be making it up as you go along, and that's exactly what Admiral Rayborn and his staff were doing with the Polaris system. They made it up as they went along, and they did beautifully. There it is.
Not exactly.
No, all right. The next movie is Casablanca. Who's seen Casablanca? Oh, yeah, right. Humphrey Bogart is on the veranda of his gin joint with Claude Rains, who plays the French policeman. And they're having a conversation, and Rains says to him, "Rick, what brought you to Casablanca?" Right? And Bogart looks at him and says, "I came from the waters." Absolutely straight face, came from the waters. And Rains looks back at him and says, "Waters, waters, this is the desert." And Bogart says, "I was misinformed." That's what you have to be able to say in acquisition, because it's true. It will happen. You will work on something, and it won't work right. I used to teach at the now Defense Acquisition University, and I would talk about testing, developmental testing, operational testing. And I showed this great film. It's done by the Air Force. The Air Force was working on the shape of a new kind of bomb. So they had to test it, and they had it on an F-111. Is that it? They had it on an F-111, and the F-111 was going to drop the bomb, right? And there's a chase plane alongside, taking pictures of this in slow motion. What happens? The bomb's on a pylon. You know, the thing holds it to the wing. The pylon comes off. Well, the pylon is aerodynamic, so you can see it gradually go like this, and then it becomes an airfoil, and it takes the bomb into the tail of the airplane. Now, they didn't lose the plane, they got it back on the ground. But when you look at that, you say, how can that happen? The pylon's fixed to the damn wing. That happens in this business. All right, what do I do to make this work? Wait a minute.
Page down.
Page down.
Ha ha. Yes, there's the Holly book. There's some case studies. Here's more case studies. Can you see any of those? Can you see them? All right. Lots of case studies. And when I wrote this paper, I was very frustrated. I said, wait a minute, that's not how we do history. We've got to do something better than that. How do we tie all the case studies together? Maybe we can't. I want to leave you with that. Maybe we can't. Next. Oh, here's analyses of process and policy. I'll do these real quick because I got to get done. The first one is The Politics of Defense Contracting from 1981 by Gordon Adams. A good book then, a good book now. Next to it is Tom McNaugh's book, New Weapons, Old Politics from 1989. Again, a good book then and a good book now. And an even more interesting one over there on the far right, which I didn't discover for some years. The Weapons Acquisition Process by Merton Peck, who was a retired Navy captain, and Frederick Scherer, who was either a graduate student or a brand new faculty member at MIT. They did that in 1962. They did something very interesting. They said, look, the 3 key variables in acquisition, right? Always keep one more hidden. The 3 key variables are cost, schedule, and performance. And guess what they said? These are economists, smart people. You can trade off cost, schedule, and performance. And you should. This should be a conscious, deliberate activity. And they tried to show how to do it in this book that goes back to 1962. Down here is then Rear Admiral Donald Pilling's book on competition in defense procurement from 1989. He got to take a year to study at the Brookings Institution. This is when John Lehman, Secretary of the Navy, was hot on firm fixed price contracts. And then, right? Pilling went out to show, no, it doesn't always work this way. And I said to him when I talked to him about this book, I said, weren't you taking a chance? He said, yeah. But he said, I figured Secretary Lehman was too busy to worry about that. You know, who cares? And that is the sad thing. It didn't get a lot of attention because it is a very short book, but very densely argued, very quantitative. So you really have to be dedicated to this field if you're going to look at this. Here's Norman Friedman's book on network-centric warfare, which is worth the price of the book just for the endnotes. Because again, what he does is he talks about how the Navy went from an analog service to a digital service, and why it did so and what it meant. It's extraordinary. I mean, when I started working in the with the Pentagon back in 1981. Anti-submarine warfare, it was passive detection, right? You listened. You listened to the submarines. Here they come, you listen, right? And then you had to target them with an active system. Not anymore. And that's a tremendous revolution, and he talks about it. It's also, again, a series of case studies. Norman Augustine, who I wish had been the Secretary of Defense and never was, but did help create Lockheed Martin. Augustine's laws, which are a tongue-in-cheek look at acquisition. But his focus, again, is process and policy. And I got to finish, I'll do it real quick. There are also approaches to management. This is a classic book. Ron Fox's book on the Defense Management Challenge. He calls it the Management Challenge Acquisition in 1988. I read this when I was going through what was then the Defense Systems Management College. Excellent book, really good. Still stands the test of time. And he talks about, you know, all the trade-offs you do, but it's not history. Neither is this. This is Chuck Spinney, Franklin Spinney. Here he is in 1985 on the cover of Time magazine. He made a very powerful argument inside the Pentagon, and then he published a book so that everybody could read it. And his argument was that systems were getting so expensive that the services were buying fewer and fewer of them. As a consequence of that, the overall military capability of the United States was going down. Very simple, that's how the argument went. Then he goes through case after case to try to show he's right. Here's Ron Fox's second book, Defense Acquisition Reform, 1960-2009. Walt, you're listed as one of the co-authors of that, or Walt, right? Yes. I don't know whether you're happy or not.
Very nice of him.
Well, but again, Fox has tried to look at this, but his perspective, he's Harvard Business School, his perspective is management. Here's the one I did with Mark and Norman Friedman, Innovation Carrier Aviation, looking at the Navy's adoption of the angle flight deck and steam catapults and the landing light system after World War II. Here's another one I did. I had time to sit down and talk to then Rear Admiral Wayne Meyer, who was head of the Aegis program in the Navy, and he was very candid. I had to take out some of the words. But I still got it. I got it right. And he made me the nicest compliment years later. He said he read and reread that article, and he still liked it. But again, what I was trying to do was capture his management philosophy and technique. And then finally, this is something rather different. John Lukács, the historian. And I've been influenced by Lukács's argument that if you're going to do something like acquisition history, you have to know what you're talking about. It helps to have done it. You can't just sort of waltz in and say, I got a PhD. By the way, I've been studying the politics of the Reformation, but I got a PhD, that's my ticket. And right, I know how to do research. And Lukács's argument is that in some areas, that's not enough. You really have to have done the work, or at least sat alongside the people who've done it. You have to feel what they've felt. You have to see the world through their eyes. It's a very powerful argument. I think there's some truth to it, because I started writing about acquisition, but only after I had really gotten into it, you know, studied it, and then done it. And by the way, I was not particularly successful at it. Now, one more here. Okay, there it is. This is what is this thing? The F-35C. This is the new JSF. Oh yeah, the numbers always change. Landing on the carrier Eisenhower, and this was in the Naval Institute proceedings, right? And it says passing the test. This is a developmental test. What's wrong? You don't pass developmental tests. Developmental testing is to learn. Operational testing is pass-fail. So again, this is something you don't know unless you've done the business. And it's not something that we do when we go out and buy a car. We don't do developmental testing on cars. That's the manufacturer's job. We just go buy the damn thing off the shelf or off the lot. So most of us don't have any experience with this kind of development. It's not a matter of whether the airplane can land on the carrier. It is at what speed we land. Right? How much force is being exerted against the arresting gear wires? What is the visibility from the pilot's position as the pilot comes in to land? And so on. All these kinds of things. You think you know the answers. You're trying to learn what the real answers are. And then you'll go from DT to OT, operational testing, where you can take the thing out and put it in freeze. So I always use this. And what you find is that even senior people in the Pentagon don't know the difference between DT and OT, which is one reason they're always on one of those backs. A potential solution was the series of books all by historian Paul Koistonen. 5 volumes. He did 5 volumes on the political economy of American warfare. Starting in 1996 was the first one, and he finished up publishing the last one, State of War, in 2012. I just want to say one thing about these. 2 things. It's like that Monty Python thing. It's one thing, 2 things, 2 things. First, it's his perspective, the political economy of American warfare. Is that the right perspective? He tells you right up front that's what he's doing. But you have to ask yourself, is that the right perspective to do histories of acquisition? All right? Because it leads you off, away from history, to economics and politics. Second, he uses for this book secondary sources. I understand why. There's so much stuff out there. But again, does he really understand what went on? Question. And there are people who disagree with him. And the folks who do, a third one, if you can see it, it's a book called Is War Necessary for Economic Growth by Vernon Rutan, published in 2006. Rutan's an economist. He says, no, that's not correct. War is not a drag on the economy necessarily. You have to go case by case. You have to look at the numbers. But he's not, again, a historian. He's an economist. So if you want to do history of acquisition, you are in the fish tank, right, with sharks. Economists, if you don't think they're sharks, work with them. Economists, management specialists, journalists, right, muckrakers, they're all in that tank with you. And they, and some of them are very, very good, very perceptive, and very good writers. Now, next, here's what I wanted to brag about. This. The Defense Acquisition History Project. That's Jacques Gansler down here. This is his successor, Pete Eldridge. Gansler was Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition. And he put this project together. And I thought it was extremely well done because first, they did this one. They got people together, remember there was a conference over at the National Defense University, providing the means of war is what came out of it. It was they were testing 2 things. One was, 3 things, I keep forgetting. First, are there people who can do this work? Are there scholars out there? I don't care whether they wear a uniform or not, whether they have a PhD or not, but they really know the field. Can they do it? The answer, I think, after reading the contents of this is yes. Very definitely yes. Second, how should they do it? Should they take chunks of history and look at each chunk and say, here's what happened in these chunks? They tried that, and it looked kind of interesting. There were ways to break up the acquisition history. And the third thing they did was say, is it still possible to do case studies? Should we do them? Should we look at something like Brilliant Pebbles, missile defense? Is that worthwhile intellectually? And the answer was yes. So I thought that was a really interesting effort. And out of it came some things. We have Tom Rossman right here. Tom, stick your hand up. Don't throw anything at it. Over on the right, Sources of Weapon Systems in Relation to the Department of Defense, the Role of Research and Development, 1945-2000, published in 2008. For a generation, I've been arguing that you didn't need to go into really highly classified stuff to see the patterns. You didn't need to. It was in the trade press. Tom proved it with this book. If you haven't looked at this book, you care about acquisition, you care about it as a researcher, you care about it as somebody who uses this stuff, that's a good place to start. Then 2, there's supposed to be a whole list, what, 5, 6 volumes out of the Acquisition History Project, 5? Yeah. 2 of them are out. The first one from Elliott Converse from 1945-1960, Rearming for the Cold War. The second from Walter Poole, 2013, Adapting to Flexible Responses. These are really good pieces of work, in my opinion. You can disagree with me, but I really, this is really good stuff. Why? Because people got the time to do the work right. They got the time, and they were qualified, and they had help. You had colleagues, a bunch of you met over and over again, which I thought was just a wonderful idea. Okay, PPVS, not much on this, because it's controlled by the priesthood. I was for a year the principal deputy director of OSD PA&E. I was told by the chief priest in the organization, PPVS, a very wonderful guy, very bright, brilliant, that, okay, you're an appointee, you're not stupid, but you really don't know how to do this. You can imagine what my answer was. But I was very kind and thoughtful, and meant to be, because I was talking to a very dedicated public servant. But that's what's happening. That's why we don't have any good histories of PPPs. We don't have, this is Charles Hitch, by the way, who's one of the people who invented it. And if you really want to understand it, look over here on the right, his lectures at the University of California, Berkeley, right? Yeah. Decision making in the Department of Defense, University of California, Berkeley. There was a conference, April 1965. You have to read this. You get a sense of where those ideas came from and why he was so interested in seeing to it that this process was implemented in the Department of Defense. But notice the contrast. Up here, you can barely see it because I couldn't find a good picture of it. This is from 1967, The Economics of Defense in the Nuclear Age by Charles Hitch and Roland McKean. It's an analysis. These are people trained in economics, operations research. You know, it's a quantitative analysis. But what I was looking for was a history. This is a fascinating case study. George Wilson, the late reporter for the Washington Post, he took a look in 1999 how the defense budget was put together. And he went down and talked to the budget officers and the services. It's really illuminating. It's a simple book, but very informative. This is what you have here. This isn't history. It's just not there. Nobody's done a history, to my knowledge, PPVS. Nobody has done a history because, oh gosh, how many have worked on it? Who's worked in the Pentagon on this stuff? Okay, is it fun? I see little hands like this. Why? Were you embarrassed?
It's just hard.
Yes, it's just, that's my point. It is hard. It is hard slogging. So nobody wants to sort of dip into this stuff the way Irving Holley did, you know, looking at airplanes, dig into this stuff, talk to all the people, do the interviews, look at the documentation, survive, and say, aha, this is what those scoundrels have been doing. And that's really sad. But I can just bet you, nobody's going to write that. I wouldn't do it. First, I'm not going to live long enough. And second, it'll be sure to make me die soon, trying to dig into this stuff. All right, so, I'm sorry, Michael, I've gone on too long. What are my conclusions? First, there are a lot of serious acquisition studies, lots of them, case studies. Some of them are excellent. And this, the Acquisition History Project is a wonderful start, and one I compliment the people who got it going and the people who've done it. There are a few similar studies of planning, programming, budgeting, and budgeting. There are just not that many. We get a lot of reporting on it, but we don't get serious studies of what were they doing and why. There are multiple academic approaches to acquisition, mostly case studies and sort of management analyses, economic analyses, and so on. Not many serious histories, except Paul Poiston's. There are problems. Classification. We were talking before we came over here. I was talking to Curtis Utz about A12. Right? Classic. Oh man, I can tell you about that, but I won't. Because I'll get in trouble. But it's a classic study. It's a classic study of people who thought the thing was going to work, and it didn't work the way they thought it was going to work. And so a senior official in the Defense Department, namely the secretary, who was then Dick Cheney, said, "To hell with this, I'm not taking it anymore." And then he made a mistake and canceled contract himself without going to his chief contracting officer for the Department of Defense. Well, classification. What really went on there? What really happened? Access to business files. There's hardly any access to business files. Business is the agent. You know, people build ships, build the airplanes, build all this stuff, build the software. You know, I've studied this stuff. I've talked to people in businesses. Sometimes they're very helpful. But it's all anecdotal, almost all anecdotal. So you just don't really get to see their files. And when the companies, remember that? In the early 90s, after the end of the Cold War, the Last Supper, whoops, defense industry is going to collapse on itself. Where do you think all that paper went? In the trash. You lost it. Partisan analysis, people are, you know, still writing, criticizing the process, pointing out its weaknesses, advocating change. The complexity of the topics. I don't know how to manage software, so I got out of the business. Became a historian, right? Because I don't have to take the rap for failed software programs. Software fails all the time. Look what we went through this morning. This happens all the time. I mean, this has become the new normal. We accept this. Remember the F-35 JSF? They had a fly-off when? 2001? Yeah, they did the fly. You know, the two prototypes. Boeing had one, Lockheed had one. Everybody said, "Oh man, this is great acquisition management." And I was standing over in the corner going, And I was at a meeting and I was over the corner going, you know, being nasty. And somebody said, what's wrong with you? I said, the guts of this thing is the software, not the hardware. It's nice to know how the planes perform, right? The surfaces, the airplanes, all that. Aerodynamically how they perform, but that's not, this thing is not hardware. It is software first, hardware second. I was proved right. I am not happy to have been proved right. And finally, the point that John Lukács makes, which is, how do you understand this stuff? If it takes you 15 years to really become an expert in contracting, or in the process of negotiating a negotiated contract, right? Cost some sort of cost contract. What historian's going to be able to take the time to do that? So it really, you know, it really puts a block right in front of you if you're a historian. You say, where do I want to understand this? I want to write about it, I want to study it. Wham! You run right into that. Do you know systems engineering? Yes, no. Do you know contracting law? Yes, no. Do you know how negotiations proceed between government and its agents out in private industry? Yes, no. Do you know testing? Yes, no. Do you know logistics? Yes, no. I've been working on this stuff for a long time, and I've just scratched the surface. And that's why you've not seen any book from me like you saw from I.B. Holland, because he got down in it and he really understood it. He's my model, and I was glad he was still alive and I could write to him and tell him that. So that's my conclusion. And now, I'm sorry for taking up so much time. We'll let the others talk.
Okay, each of the discussants will have a few minutes to present their ideas, and then we'll open up to general discussion. Afterwards, we'll discuss with Dr. Guerrero.
Okay. Hi, I'm Larry Ferrero. Let me take the slide down. I'm a naval architect, so I just want to point out that you're standing in the old experimental model basin of David W. Taylor. This was the first model basin in the United States and in the Navy. This is where all of the ships, battleships, cruisers, destroyers that fought in the First and Second World Wars, the hull forms were tested right here. Unfortunately, the slides are not here. My talk is called From Historiography to Pedagogy, so there's another word you have to look up. The case for teaching history to defense acquisition professionals. Tom's done a fantastic job. On the supply side, I'm going to talk about the demand side. Why should defense acquisition professionals care about defense acquisition history, and how do we get them to not only care, but to make use of it? And the example I gave is the fact that our Chief Acquisition Officer, Frank Kendall, often uses a particular case history for talking about defense acquisition and acquisition reform. The book is 6 Frigates. And some of you know this. This is the story of the original 6 frigates from the 1790s, which had to go through a very political acquisition process. And he makes some very cogent points. And it's a fantastic narrative, and it's really compelling. But as Tom has already pointed out, there's a lot of compelling narratives about acquisition that are available. So the question is, how do we get acquisition professionals at all levels to be interested in this? And in academic terms, every professor will tell you you have to give the people in your class, or that you're trying to reach, a whiffum. What's in it for me? So the question is, how do we get acquisition professionals to use, on a routine basis, the histories that Tom is talking about? Well, to do that, I think we need to take a leaf from the page of what the military has now been doing for over a century. And the slide would have shown you, so I'm just going to read this off. What's in it for the military? Why does military at the service colleges and the ROTCs, and then all the way up to the staff colleges and the war colleges become imbued and imbibe military history? And more to the point, why do they imprint them when they're young, as Gosnells, and continue to teach it throughout their career? Because over time, the military has come to understand that it develops leadership skills. It develops the ability to think strategically versus tactically. Why, not just how? It's context. wars are the products of culture, politics, economics, and technologies. It has to take place in a context the military understands that, and they understand that very well. Wars are pretty infrequent, despite what you might see on the news. It is actually a rare occurrence over history to fight major wars, and as we all know, they're fluid, and they're never like the last one. And I don't know who came up with that abominable statement that we always fight the last war, because that's never been true. Because the people who are out there always understand what is happening on the front lines, and they do that because they've studied what's happened in the past, because so they can apply it. It's a necessary tool, and I'm using that term quite specifically, for thinking about doctrine, thinking about planning. History becomes one of the tools you use when you're up in the Pentagon, or in the field, or in the front office to understand what to do next. So when I teach at Defense Acquisition University, I teach systems engineering, among other things, and I give a historical case example, the military heads nod, but the civilian ones do not. And that's the point I'm going to be making, is the audience really needs to be the civilians, which is the majority of the people who are doing acquisition on a day-to-day basis. So how do we get there? Well, again, let me take a quick leaf from the book of the military. They did not arrive at teaching military history from the start of West Point in 18-something, or the Naval Academy in 18-something else. West Point and Annapolis both emphasized tactics and maneuvers. That was their bread and butter. It was only between the 1880s, almost getting close to a century after the first ideas started to be founded through the 1930s, that we started to get the Naval War College, the Army War College, and they were emphasizing strategic thinking, and that you needed critical historical analysis. And it started to be carried over to the service academies. Post-World War II, we started to see the rise of military history into more civilian academic institutions, Harvard, MIT. There's military history of different sorts at many different academic institutions. And today, we know, as I said, cadets, midshipmen, all have doolies, all have to take military history right from the get-go, because they need to understand how to use it as part of their day-to-day doctrinal and planning thinking. So, why should civilian defense acquisition professionals follow that same path? Same things. Thinking strategically. The last system that we bought is not going to be like the next system that we bought. So how do we actually understand, not just from my own experience, because it's pretty infrequent. Major acquisition programs can take 10, 15 years. You might be lucky to be on one program in your lifetime, and I know one person and one person only who's ever been on 2 full-scale acquisition programs, start to finish, in ship design. And he's now retired. So the same reason why military uses it, civilian defense acquisitions also. Technology and systems are products of culture, they're products of politics, and it gives, by understanding what's happened, it gives you the tools to make decisions in future without having to rely on guesswork and rely on anecdotal evidence. Now the problem, as I said, is they're civilians. I'm a civilian. Most of the people I've worked with are. So what do we do? And I had several bullet points. My first statement is, just like the military, we have to find a way to imprint them when they're young, when they're goslings and just coming up, so that they understand and can use it on a day-to-day basis. Universities. Is defense acquisition a scholarly, serious scholarly endeavor? Not very much, not very often. What about the DoD and the Department of the Navy? Do we have any sort of professionalization programs that are aimed specifically at bringing up people so that they can be steeped in the history of defense acquisition? Well, where I teach, DAU, DSMC, we're a training university. We train to how the DoD does things. That's what Congress actually says in the law. So are there other places? Now, of course, National Defense University does that, but the cohorts are pretty small. I'm going to make a shout out to my accessory who's in the front row. He runs a war room, and it's a great war room that the Department of Navy has on naval acquisition. And it's wonderful, but it's by invitation only. And you can't do acquisition history, you can't do history by invitation only. So how do you open the aperture so that a large number of people are not just interested in doing the history, but also understand how to use it? I am trying to stand up a professional reading program myself, similar to what the CNO's professionalization reading program is. We need, and this is the main point, to get any of this done, we need a demand signal. More to the point, we need demand signals from the DoD, the DON, from acquisition commands, from the senior leadership that says we need that product and we need our people to use that product. Without that demand signal, which is what got the military academy started, the staff colleges, the war colleges started over a century ago, this will not happen. And it's going to take time. It took the military almost a century to get that kind of relationship between history and professionalization to where it is today. It's going to take us a while. That's it.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Michael. Thanks, everybody. I'm going to try to be brief. I can begin by saying that Tom's presentation has really brought me all kinds of thoughts. I'll make a couple of comments about what I've just heard. First is that, yes, as a matter of fact, part of the thing, I was honored to have a part in the Defense Acquisition History Project. There was just this small technical point that great conference was held at SAIC, and that's part of the story, which is right in the middle of writing a history of defense acquisition. We were involved in an elaborate contracting process because SAIC held the contract for the initial phase of the project, and so we had it at their headquarters, and then after a year, in spite of their earnest desire to continue the program, we all became individual, the writers became individual contractors through the Department of the Army and worked at the Center of Military History. That actually brought a memory because a couple of things. Tom was great at talking about these movies. And the movie that I wanted to use in my presentation, because I was going to be studying the period, my volume was that I worked on was to cover the period from 1969 to about 1980. And so I brought Woody Allen's movie Sleeper, which has scenes of, this is from the 22nd century or whatever it is. And so we have these moments when they're trying to escape, and the pursuers unveil these super high-tech, wonderful, powerful, fearsome-looking weapon systems that blow up the minute you try to use them. And I was recognizing, of course, that Woody Allen was commenting about our time in those days when the perception of the defense acquisition process was that it kept producing these systems that basically didn't work. And the trouble was that the day I was to make my presentation, this is September of 2001, that I came in the morning of September 11th, all set to make my presentation. And I arrive at SAIC headquarters, and there are these huge TV monitors up in the main foyer, all showing things blowing up. And I thought, I think I'd better kill the disc on this one. And so I gave a much more boring account in which I don't think I even mentioned the perception that our systems don't work. But that's an anecdote. I really have kind of 2 points that I want to talk about. That's two items I'm going to mention. and forget all the other great ideas that I've got. The first is about this issue that he brings up, John Lukács, and the whole thing about understanding what you're writing about. And I would have to say that, yeah, at the very start, I had to get smart about defense acquisition. I was greatly helped that the period I was covering was the period when the 5,000 series directives were originally created. So by studying these, I could get the beginning of an idea of what this was about. But I had to spend a lot of my time just getting smart on how this stuff operates. I got my history PhD. I've had a lot of experience writing Air Force history, writing institutional history inside the Defense Department. And yet, this was a whole field on which I had, my knowledge was at best superficial. And so that's, you know, somebody who comes at it, who's done the stuff, who's been a program manager or a contracting officer or whatever your specialization has been, already has, or taken a course at DAU for that matter, has that stuff, and still you're going to come into stuff that you've got to get smart on. So that one of the, you know, the obstacles involve that very issue, and I would say that anybody coming into this is one of the reasons it's so hard. This is one of the reasons it takes time, is that you need something, and as I was looking into the documentation, and I would say incidentally about that thing about having practical experience, interviews, oral history interviews were one of the most valuable things. I thought one of the most valuable experiences I had was taking part in an interview with Norman Augustine, and I had some of the others that I was involved with. I was even in on the interview with Robert McNamara, which provided a wonderful perspective. That is an area where you have to recognize that nobody is walking in this with expert knowledge about the subject. You know, that's why you're doing research in the first place. It's just a matter that you need some sort of background to be able to read these documents. When you talk about partisan analysis and things like that, can I spot partisan analysis in some document that's here? This is produced by somebody who's supposed to be authoritative, and when do I spot that this is a partisan argument and may be good, may be bad, may have a mix. Anyway, the other point that I wanted to talk about was that as you talk about the obstacles, that's where you get into the whole thing of the management. And I mentioned how we were involved in this, that I was working as a contractor. I was first an employee of SIIC, and then I was an independent contractor working on a volume. And the management of this, you know, is the people who can do this are not exactly a dime a dozen, and it takes them a long time. And Tom was talking about 10 years, and it would have taken me that long to get to where I wished I'd gotten. But with that, I mean, I would say that I am really delighted that and that means, you know, we started with talking about Jack Ansler starting this idea that there should be a defense acquisition history project and getting it on the road. But at every point, you have to ask, is somebody willing to commit the resources that it will take to get something done? And that remains a perennial question, and that is what the task of managing these projects is about. The other, so with that, the only other thing I would say is Tom was pointing out the 2 volumes actual chronological volumes. We have, with Tom Lassman, we have somebody who's working on the project now, and thanks, Tom, I'm glad you're here. And I might think that maybe at some point we might just take a couple minutes for Tom to give us an update on where we stand on that. With that, I will sit down. I will say one other thing, which is that I also feel honored to have been a student of I.B. Holly's in an earlier incarnation, but that was before I appreciated that Buying Our Aircraft was a book I needed to read before I was ever going to do any acquisition history. So thank you.
Well, I need to kind of correct the record. Why am I standing up here? I don't have a PhD. Boo. So,
Good for you. Good for you.
already felt. The other reason is, why am I talking about acquisition? I think Tom asked who in here has done PPPS. I did 5 years of PPPS on Army staff as an Army staff officer for 5 years, and we called it PPPES because we included the year of execution. If you don't understand why that made it more complicated, then you don't know anything about acquisition. And I mean that. And that's a very simple relationship that suggests how complex this thing is sometimes. And part of the key, and the big elephant, I think, in the room that Tom talks about, if you get Tom's paper, he talks about Stephen Kuntz talking about one of those books that never sold was the one that was about acquisition. And that is true. It's the one that didn't sell. But the elephant in the room is why. 1916, Bradley Fisk writes about strategy. And he says, here's the reason that we really don't talk about material acquisition. He says something about, the reason we talk about war strategy is because it's vivid, stimulating, and resultful. And then by comparison, we don't talk about this other stuff because it's dull, plodding, and for the strategist himself, it is resultless. And that's accurate. This is, without a doubt, one of the most boring subjects you can ever try to embrace. I'll give you an example. I'm sitting in the office one day, I just ran across a document that appeared to suggest it was written on legal paper. It's a great document, names were erased on it, bottoms were torn off, and it made it look as if the Navy was cutting some sort of magic drug deal with Litton Industries to essentially hoodwink Congress into giving money to one program, and so Litton could then use that capital in the successful program to try to salvage Carolyn. And one of the historians, and let's say his name's Mark Evans, only hypothetical, comes in and says, very collegially, hey, what are you working on? I said, I found this. Let me show you. And I turn around and I pick up, and I turn back and he's gone. He's not there. Now when I talked to Mark about that incident, he goes, no, that's not what happened at all. That's important, believe it or not. It's boring. So let me ask, one, will historians' contributions find an acceptance among the acquisition community, especially if you write analytical history? I would argue simply no. It won't find favor. And the reason is because the narrative's already there. It's already developed. It's done. You already have the journalists who are experts in this area that have been writing for years. They know what the narrative is. You also have political economists, Tom talked about. They've already written what the narrative is, and that's the narrative. I had, in fact, one senior Navy official who's since retired, when I was talking to him about acquisition history, and his comment to me was kind of interesting. He goes, you historians, you people, you got to spend all those times with documents. The real story is what I've got to tell you, my story. Now let me go back to my story about Mark Evans. My story is, I turn around and Mark was gone. Mark doesn't remember it that way. So where, in fact, does the real story about acquisition live? If you take it from the people that have done it for many, many years, that's all they need to know. And it's like passing on the fable from generation to generation to generation, and that becomes ground truth. And all of a sudden the historian is parachuted into the middle of what I think Tom talked about as a fishbowl. And you have to tell a story that they may not want to hear. They may not agree with. Their personal experience will say, that didn't happen. And you're going to go, I got 10 documents from 5 different people that say that happened. No, it didn't. Didn't happen that way. Okay, all right. So the narration is already established, so it's going to be really, really difficult to do. Second, what is your audience? Who is your audience? Who are you writing for? Are you writing for the acquisition professionals that Larry talks about we need to be writing for? Who are you writing for? That narrative will say something different than if you are writing for, let's say, the engineering. People that Larry knows very well. An engineering design history is significantly different than the political history involved in an acquisition program. What they may find useful isn't going to be the political history, if that's the way you choose to approach it. They want to hear the design history. They want to read about the design history. Or they want to hear how that process evolves, the PPPES process or the PPPS process. That's what they want to hear. And they already know the answers. Ask them. They'll tell you. It's interesting. So who's going to welcome this? I don't know. It's going to be difficult. The example is I was told one time, I was trying to gather information on the LCS. Everybody knows what the LCS is. And I'm over at the PEO's office, PM's office. And essentially I'm told, not only are we not going to give you an oral interview on this program, we're just not going to talk to you because you're frankly no better than the press. But the second thing we're not going to do is it's already written. The history of the LCS program is written. It's done. It's Bob Wert's stuff that's on the internet. That's all we need to know. That's it. We don't need to know anything else. Okay. So what you'll do is you will find yourself, if you write the history, caught between the versions of the systems analysts, the engineers, and everybody else that has been inculcated with how it's supposed to be done. Sources are going to be difficult. And then the other big elephant in the room that I think is interesting is we talk a lot about reform right now, about acquisition reform. And that's a big deal all the time. You know, Goldwater Nichols did horrible things to the CNO's role in acquisition. He took it out of the Uniform Navy's hands. It's more and more institutionalized inside the civilian bureaucracy, and those civilian guys wouldn't know a war had one kicked them in the behind. Well, the problem with all this, and this acquisition community issue, is the one that's always left out is Congress. We're not writing about how Congress has, in fact, evolved over time to deal with acquisition. How have they? In 1947, they dropped a Navy committee and a military committee, and they formed House Armed Services Committee and the Senate Armed Services Committee. Over time, they formed the HIPSCI and the SISTI for intelligence. Why is the House not reformed itself? Why is the Senate not reformed itself? Why is Congress not reformed itself? And how has that influence, that lack of reform and the growth of those staffs, changed the way acquisition occurs in the real world? And so I just kind of throw out those couple of ideas, spun off a little bit of Tom and certainly a little bit of Larry's stuff. So that's it. Thank you.
We now have about 15 minutes that we can all discuss. I want this to be discussion among the four on the platform here, but I want it to be an open discussion. Not just you ask me 10 questions, but you can come up with your own point of view. So I have a question which I'm just to the four of you. You don't need to answer it now, but at some point in the next 15 minutes, I'd like your answer to that. And that is, what is it that the historian has to offer in acquisition and programming that other types of scholars don't offer? Thank you.
Well, I'll answer that first. Lance gave the answer, which is there's already a narrative in most cases. So you come up with something that's real, better. That's it. Because if you know the area, whatever it is, and you're a good historian, we can argue about what that is, you can put your finger on stuff. You really can. And then people may find that useful. So in a sense, you may run counter to the narrative. Right? Okay, fine. So you do. You may not find many people who listen. Okay, somebody will. Somebody will publish it. Somebody will put it out. You may not do your career really good. That's the hard part. I tell people who want to do this kind of work, always have another job in your back pocket. Because you may say things people want to hear. Now, I like the acquisition field, I like the people who are in it. I admire the good ones. There are people who are ordinary and others who are less than ordinary, but the good ones I admire very much. And they've always been helpful to me and interested in the sort of things that I do. But, you know, it's tough. As Lance says, you go to the office and you talk to these people and, you know, they go, no, you're no better than a journalist. You are, but they don't know that. So one of the most important things you have to do is show them the difference. It's not easy, right? Not easy. I went to that with Wayne Meyer. 3 appointments I had with that man to start the interviews. Each time he backed out and told me he didn't like it. 4th time, he said, I can't keep throwing you out the door. I'm going to have to talk to you. And then he was happy that he did. But that's it. It's just hard. Now, what do you do if you're trying to get access and you're not producing anything? Right? If you're an academic, a young academic in the university, people are going, you're not writing anything. If you're working for the Navy History and Heritage Command, it is, you're not making any progress. The people you're supposed to be studying don't want to even talk to you. What's wrong with you? Yeah, right? So these are real problems. But you got to go at it because you have something to offer them. You really do. And I think it's proved by the Defense Acquisition History Project that the stuff that's come out of it is good. It really is. So that's my answer.
Quick question for, sorry, I forgot your name, the gentleman who's studying the 1970s.
Yeah.
There's a passage in Norman Friedman's book, I forget which one it is, but he makes some comment that because of the Vietnam War and the Navy, or not the Navy, but McNamara didn't want to buy, spend the money he wanted to spend on the Vietnam War. He didn't want to buy a ship, a new class of ships. So he basically created the DoD 5000 process as a way to delay acquisitions so that you wouldn't have to buy them now, understanding that when they came around later it was going to cost more money. Is that borne out by your research?
Yeah, well, the real genesis of the 5000 series was David Packard in 1969 as Deputy Secretary of Defense when the Nixon administration came in and Melvin Laird became Secretary of Defense, and Packard came in as who better to as a management genius in his own inimitable way, and he what the first thing, and as I vividly remember sitting in my office or sitting at lunch with some of my colleagues in 1970 when the first directive came out, and and somebody in there said, I get one thing from that, concurrency is out. And the whole idea of concurrent development that was absolutely central to the McNamara approach was being thrown away because it produced disasters like the C-5, which actually worked when they got it, but it was perceived as a disaster, and because it was way after, financially speaking, it was, but the point is that that what McNamara had run into was that he was determined to reform the system. He produced PPPS, which is still with us in one form or another. But he also produced this whole series of ideas about acquisition, which were perceived by 1969 to be a total failure. And so Packard was in there to reform it. And whatever you want to say about the 5000 series directives, they were most definitely a step in the right direction. But that's, and that the story of what I was undertaking to deal with was the development of the early years of that whole process and of trying to produce a new approach to acquisition, which may have avoided some disasters and may have generated others, but that's a lot of that is bringing in Congress and things like that. So there is, a lot of it was the anti-McNamara attitude that came in. Okay, that's what I got.
But let me see if I can help that a little bit. The Packard piece, certainly a step in the right direction. One of the arguments on McNamara is if you go back, and I'm going to use this horrible phrase that historians use, if you go back to the primary source document, McNamara came in to establish control over a system that was perceived to be out of control, clearly in the hands of a uniform military establishment that was making judgments based upon this kind of heuristic view of how warfare should be fought and what types of ships, warships for the Navy, were supposed to be used, to include aircraft. And one of the first things he did when he came in, and Kennedy in his first State of the Union address, comes in and says, we need strategic lift. And the result was, okay, we're going to have strategic lift, says McNamara, we're going to do the C-5A, and we're going to do this thing called the FDL, Fast Deployment Logistics. FDL never came to fruition. It was just mired in all sorts of, got caught up with union arguments and got caught up with all sorts of stuff. But a lot of times when these, the hue and cry goes up for greater management, for closer management of the acquisition process, it is oftentimes linked to a desire to get a greater handle on how the uniformed military is doing something, because it's not necessarily liked for maybe some good reason. And so it's linked to control, and also I'm going to use an overused phrase. It's also often linked to revolution in military affairs, whatever that's going to be at any given time. So when you have, oh my God, we've got nukes, we've got missiles, we've got faster, we've got jet aircraft, and the services go up and say, look, this is great, we're staying abreast. The first thing everybody else does is, we need more civilian control. You're right, we can't, if this stuff is that important, we can't leave it up to you Neanderthals to manage. Same with cyber. Same with cyber. We can't leave it up to you Neanderthals, and that's a little pejorative, and it's probably grossly overstated. But I'll tell you what, if you read Hitch, if you read McNamara, if you read the other guy whose name is still alive at Harvard, I just lost his name. You read these guys, guess what? Uniform bunch of Neanderthals. They do not have the intellectual flexibility to manage these types of systems. So that's the context that I put your piece in there about McNamara. And it's not unique to him. Josephus Daniels was the same way. Long was the same way. This is not new. This is just kind of the process of what all this acquisition stuff is. So, thank you.
I had a comment and then a sort of a challenge. One of the things I wanted to point out in your history grant on historiography, it's sort of military centric, and I thought there were lessons out there that needed to be pulled in too. And the one that struck me was Frederick Brooks' book on the mythical man months. So when he talked about software engineering, he happened to be the developer of the IBM 360 series. He had some very cogent points about how that process worked, including the fact that anytime, from whatever your best estimate was, it was going to take, I think it was 3 times as long and cost 5 times as much. But the challenge I wanted to ask is, being a PBBE practitioner for almost 30 years, and actually believing in your comment about you have to be a practitioner to be able to talk about a subject. So I'm always looking at practitioners versus other talking heads. I always want to still come back to how do we do it better, which is the lesson learned kind of process. And with a 30-year view, it's kind of like the lesson learned is that we never learned the lesson. So I want to challenge you to go from a passive mode from the historical view to an active mode. How do you take all that acquisition and acquisition management stuff and translate it into stuff other than trying to be like a DAU or NDU kind of thing? How do you make it broad to get everybody involved in it? And say, here's the things we're pulling, whether it's aircraft or ships or software, whatever. Here's the things. These are the milestones that we need to do to make something work a little bit better.
Well, I'm going to repeat what I said. Don, do you mind?
No, go right ahead.
I'm going to repeat what I said up there. We need a strong demand signal from leadership, because you will not get the kind of buy-in and engagement from people who can use those lessons. And I tend not to, I don't necessarily cotton to the idea of lessons learned. That seems very narrow. I've always believed in what Mark Twain never said but should have, which is history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. You are trying to get people to understand the context and the why. Clausewitz didn't say acquisition is the continuation of politics by other means, but it is. And to understand that context helps you to make decisions. You're not going to, I do not believe you will get people involved in the process, whether they're in the DoD, the Department of the Navy, industry, Congress, policymakers, policy influencers, which are the think tanks, and other places, unless there is a serious and concerted demand signal from leadership, and notice how I'm leaving that very broad, that says we need this in order for our process to be better. That's what happened with the different services over time at at the Naval War College, the Army War College. There was a demand signal from military leadership that said we need to change the way we think about strategy, and it eventually became part of the fabric of the professionalization of that that cadre. We need a defense acquisition professional cadre which has those capabilities as part of their fabric. That's what I said earlier, and I'm repeating.
There is some good news. I'll give you one example. Life cycle costing. Everybody know what that is? You cost the system out, it costs its life cycle. Great innovation. Now, costing itself is what? Systematic practice or an art? It's an art. Okay, so you're building this systematic life cycle costing analysis on an art, what is essentially an art. That's okay, because there's some people who are very good at it. They're very good at the art. They have to be listened to. But in my time working in and around the Pentagon, you know, when they took the wanted posters down and had my face on it, life cycle costing was a tremendous innovation, it really was. It said, look at the cost of maintenance, look at the cost of support, look at the cost of training. And that allowed you to do really good programming. I mean, it goes hand in hand with programming. And, you know, I thought it was wonderful. And I did one good thing with it, right? You always have to ask yourself, in my time working in the Department of Defense, did I do any good thing? Yes, I killed those damn battleships with life cycle costing and the other arguments. Yeah, I did. Because there were people who wanted to bring them back, who were in the George W. Bush administration. And the comptroller, Dov Sakheim, came to me and said, somebody told me you know something about the Navy. I said, okay, I got an answer, yes. He said, deal with that. And I did. And I wrote the memos that killed them. And I couldn't have done that if we hadn't had life cycle costing. We hadn't had people who understood what the concept programming was. Show that stuff to Navy programmers, they went, I got it. It wasn't, the problem wasn't the Navy. The Navy said, fine, we understand what you're doing. So there has been progress. And I'm very proud of that, to have been a part of that.
Some of us are due at a meeting across the way in 5 minutes. So those of you who need to leave may leave. And the rest of us can stay here and mill around. Yes.
I'll mill around. Thank you all for coming.
For coming.